All right, we're going to continue our discussion today about what has happened in the Western world in between the world wars here. So, by the time of World War I, Italy had been a modern nation state for barely 50 years. The Kingdom of Italy was not declared, if you recall, until 1861 by King Victor Emmanuel II of Sardinia, after the efforts of the great Italian statesman Camillo Benso de Cavour and the military campaigns of Giuseppe Garibaldi. Even then, Venice and Rome were not part of the Italian state until 1866 and 1870, respectively. The young state of Italy faced a lot of problems in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The fragmented nature of its beginnings caused vast differences in terms of regional wealth, education, infrastructure. For example, northern states such as Milan and Lombardy were relatively wealthy, while large parts of southern Italy still relied on heavily agricultural economies and were relatively poor. Literacy rates in Italy at the time were far lower than elsewhere in Western Europe as well. Now, this fragmented state of Italian society was reflected in its government, and very little was actually accomplished by the Italian parliament that, much like other countries, was composed of several parties. For example, from 1919 to 1922, the parliament formed 5 different governments under various coalitions and parties. To make matters worse, Italy had not been given the same favorable settlement as the other Allied powers had received by the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I, a conflict which had strained the Italian economy to a breaking point. So it was in this chaotic scene that one of the largest figures of the 20th century emerged, a man by the name of Benito Mussolini, who also had the nickname El Duce. Mussolini was born in Predappio in 1883, the son of a blacksmith. He was originally a socialist who fled to Switzerland to avoid being drafted into the Italian military. Mussolini then returned to Italy in 1904, and in 1919, he formed Italy's fascist party. And as unemployment soared and Italy descended into political anarchy, Mussolini's fascist party slowly gained popularity by running on a vehemently nationalist platform, winning 35 seats in the 1921 elections. In October of 1922, out of a fear of a communist takeover due to riots and strikes in northern Italy, Mussolini gathered his fascist followers and party foot soldiers, nicknamed the Black Shirts, because they would typically wear, you guessed it, a black shirt, and they staged a march on Rome. Once there, King Victor Emmanuel III asked Mussolini to form a government and restore order to the countryside. Over the next 3 years, Mussolini dismantled the democracy Cavour had painstakingly cobbled together, and in 1925, he declared himself dictator of Italy. And that's where he took the title El Duce, which literally means the leader. Now, fascist Italy under Mussolini was a heavily centralized and state-controlled country. Excuse me. Early in Mussolini's tenure as El Duce, he used the immense powers of the fascist state to marginally improve Italy. Social welfare programs to help the unemployed were instituted, railroads and public transportation systems were built or improved upon, and the Italian economy tended to stabilize. However, what few improvements Mussolini's government made were greatly overshadowed by the means in which he achieved them. Soon after declaring himself dictator, all other political parties were outlawed and strict press censorship was instituted. Rumors abounded that socialist leaders like Giacomo Mattarella and Giovanni Amendola were being arrested and beaten to death. Workers were stripped of the ability to strike, and although wages rose initially under Mussolini's regime, by 1929, average pay had fallen below that of 1922. In addition, the fascist government pervaded the everyday lives of Italians, feeding them propaganda, glorifying to Italy, and comparing modern Italy to the Roman Empire. Much like in Nazi Germany, it was considered the duty of any good Italian to be physically fit and have a large family that could be of service to the Italian state. Artwork that did not represent the glory of Italy or Rome was outlawed. And in order to propagate these feelings of Italian superiority and begin exerting Italian influence elsewhere, Mussolini invaded Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia, in 1935, making it a province of his new Italian empire. Naturally, in such a nationalist state, xenophobia was rampant, Anti-Semitism was particularly strong in Italy, just as it was in Germany. In 1938, Jews were barred from being government officials or serving in the military, and immigration of any further Jews into Italy was prohibited. In 1939, Mussolini and Hitler signed the Pact of Steel, solidifying the alliance between Germany and Italy. Now, when World War II broke out later that year, Mussolini and fascist Italy stood firmly by Nazi Germany's side, declaring war on Great Britain and France in 1940. And despite the emphasis Mussolini's fascist state had placed on improving the military, the Italian forces were pretty ill prepared for a full-scale war, and the Italians suffered several defeats to British and French troops in Africa and in the Balkans. What successes Italian troops had, such as in France in 1940, were often in partnership with Nazi Germany forces. In Abyssinia, the Italians lost their colonial African province, with the capital falling to British troops in 1941, and they were driven from the territory entirely by 1943. In July of 1943, Allied troops invaded the Italian island of Sicily. And before the end of the month, Mussolini's fascist government was overthrown and Il Duce himself was imprisoned. All was not immediately lost for Mussolini, because while the new Italian government sued for peace, the Germans fought on, rescuing the imprisoned dictator only 2 months after he lost power. 2 years later, in an attempt to flee the country and the advancing Allied army, where he disguised himself as a woman, Mussolini and his mistress were discovered by a group of communist leaders. And the following day, April 25th, 1945, Mussolini, his mistress, and his entire entourage were summarily executed. Let's take a look back at Russia to see what's going on there in the lead up to World War II. Lenin had suffered a stroke. He was infirm. He was in a hospital. Odds were, with the healthcare at the time, very shortly he would die, which he did. That left a little fight for power that we talked about yesterday for who would be his successor, and Joseph Stalin, rises up as the leader of Soviet Russia. Stalin was born in 1878 in what is today Georgia, not Georgia the state in the United States, but Georgia the country, but was then part of the Russian Empire. And though originally a student at the local seminary for the Georgian Orthodox Church, I know it's hard to believe Stalin was going to be a priest, Stalin was expelled in 1899 and soon after became active in the Marxist underground in Russia. And for this activity, Stalin was imprisoned multiple times in the first decade of the 20th century, even spending a period in exile in Siberia. Undeterred by this experience, Stalin continued to rise through the ranks of the fledgling Bolshevik Party, kind of becoming a key figure in the Russian government after the October 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. Stalin was a key aide to Vladimir Lenin, as I pointed out yesterday, who was the leader of the Bolshevik Party. And when the Soviet Union was instituted in 1922, Stalin was installed as Secretary General to the Central Committee of the Communist Party. After Lenin's death in 1924, Soviet and communist leadership was in limbo, and through complex and often backroom political maneuvering, Stalin won out against his rivals within the party by 1928, many of whom he soon imprisoned and or exiled. Now, soon after assuming full control of the Soviet government, Stalin set out to build Russia into an economic and industrial giant. He considered Russia 50 years behind the rest of the world in terms of industry and technology, and so he resolved to close this gap through a forced and rapid modernization process. However, in order to force such a wholesale transformation of the economy, Stalin needed total control of the Soviet economy. Fortunately, the Marxist principles Stalin's Communist Party expounded called for precisely the command economy Stalin needed. So under Stalin, the Soviet government assumed control of what few industrial complexes it didn't already own. But the most violent upheaval to the Soviet economy was Stalin's forced collectivization of agriculture. In other words, he got rid of, pardon me, allergies, small family-owned farms and forced them to give up their land to the government, and then the government would allocate land to, villages of people or an area of people, and they would all work it and share the benefits of that land together. That's collectivization. So at the time of Stalin's rise to power, the Soviet Union was still a predominantly farm-based society. And in order to create a labor pool for Russian industry and have direct control over the Soviet food supply, Stalin seized ownership of millions of farms. Now, you can imagine, we don't need as many farmers if everybody's going to share here in the village. Some of you can go work in the factories, join the military. And of course, some people don't want to do that. So those farmers who resisted, though, were forced into exile or summarily executed. And this brutal treatment was not restricted to uncooperative farmers. Stalin maintained a firm grip on power through terrorizing millions of Soviets and even Communist Party members. A secret police force roamed the Soviet countryside and cities, rooting out enemies of the revolution who were exiled or imprisoned for the smallest action or offhand comment that could be construed as anti-Soviet or anti-communist. In the late 1930s, for example, Stalin instituted the Great Purge, which he claimed was to rid the Communist Party of subversive and foreign agents, but in reality targeted thousands of Stalin's political enemies and rivals and got rid of them to secure his own position. Correspondingly, the fabled Soviet Gulag prison camp system expanded enormously in the 1930s, where those in prison were often worked to death or simply executed. And most of these gulags were out in the northernmost reaches of Siberia. So with totalitarian control over the Soviet economy and people, Stalin's regime began its modernization projects through instituting a series of 5-year plans. And the 5-year plans set relatively outrageous goals for everything from total goods for each sector of the economy to individual expected outputs from each factory. And most of these goals were impossible to meet. And factory and government officials often fudged the numbers to meet their quotas. Conditions in these factories were terrible for the workers, who were often paid in food rations and were worked to the bone. So with the forced industrialization of Russia in full swing, Stalin looked to expand Soviet influence outward in the territory the Russian Empire had lost after World War I. And soon after, Stalin signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler. He annexed Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, and invaded eastern Poland and parts of Romania. He also invaded Finland. However, when Hitler broke this non-aggression pact and invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Stalin allied with the British and French and later the Americans. And as a result, Stalin had a seat at the negotiating table with American President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in deciding the makeup of post-war Europe. And through keen negotiating skills, Stalin expanded the Soviet Union. When the Western countries recognized Soviet possession of these states, Stalin had annexed and invaded during the chaos of World War II. It should be mentioned, though, even though he invaded Finland, the Finns actually defeated the Russian army and held on to their independence. Additionally, the Soviet Union gained control of several Eastern European states, which Stalin claimed it needed as a buffer from future Central European aggression. And this became known later as the Iron Curtain. After World War II, Stalin continued to hold an iron grip on power in the Soviet Union and encouraged the growth of communism elsewhere, especially in the Korean Peninsula. Imprisonment and exile in the Soviet Union became even more common than it had been before the war, as Stalin became more and more paranoid of Western invasion. He died in 1953 at the age of 74. Probably a lot of people in the Soviet Union were actually celebrating quietly that day. One of my favorite all-time memes is a picture of Stalin, and it says, I will make everyone happy. And here's how. Kill all those being unhappy. Well, that's about sums up totally and perfectly Stalinist Russia. So let's go back to a little bit more of Western Europe, and a country we've kind of ignored for a while because its power waned after the discovery of the New World, and that is Spain. Now, here in the United States, we've had an established and successful republic for well over 200 years. But elsewhere in the world, republics are a much younger novelty, and some did not succeed in their first attempt. Here in the United States, we've had an established and successful republic for well over 200 years, but elsewhere in the world, republics are a much younger novelty, and some did not succeed in their first attempt. I feel like I'm repeating myself, but such was the case in 20th century Spain, where several years of attempted Republican rule erupted into civil war, eventually giving way to a fascist dictatorship that lasted well into the 1970s. So let's look at Spain in the 1930s, because prior to the 1930s, Spain was a constitutional monarchy under King Alfonso XIII, Though from 1923 to 1930, Spain was ruled by General Miguel Primo de Rivera, who was a military dictator. Now, Rivera's rule was marked by strict censorship of the press and a suspension of the Spanish Constitution. However, Rivera did institute multiple infrastructure projects which lowered unemployment and aided the Spanish economy. Now, an interesting note with everything that's going on today is how Rivera came to power. Rivera came to power because Spain, who was not a participant in World War I, actually suffered a great deal during World War I because of not just economic exporting and the availability to sell other things on the international market, but the Spanish flu hit Spain particularly hard. And so the economy was thrown into chaos, and Rivera stepped in with the promise to restore things. So regardless of Rivera's economic improvements, Spain was still largely a rural country, economically based on agricultural exports. And as a result, Spain was hurt considerably by the international economic downturn caused by the 1929 Wall Street collapse. For example, the precipitous fall of the prices of wine and olive oil, which are two of Spain's chief exports, caused agriculture to be virtually a worthless endeavor. Rivera's policies did little to help. In 1930, he attempted to raise public loans to pay for his social programs, and this blunder and the continued economic downturn caused Rivera to resign. Now, in the wake of Rivera's resignation, Spain held its first democratic elections of the 20th century in 1931. And the elections returned a heavily Republican majority who favored a reorganization of the Spanish government. And rather than fighting to keep the constitutional monarchy intact, Alfonso XIII chose instead to abdicate the Spanish throne and declare Spain a republic in April of 1931. The general elections that followed created a socialist government which attempted several Marxist reforms such as agrarian land redistribution and also attacked the influence of the Catholic Church in Spain. And this naturally angered the traditional landowners who, along with the Catholic Church, held considerable power within Spain. Industrialists were also angry with the new government. So you've got the upper class and the middle class now kind of angry with the government as the government raised the wages of workers without consulting business owners. The outrage at the socialist policies of the Republican government led to an attempted military coup in 1932. And though the coup failed, it was indicative of the rising opposition to the left-wing Spanish government. In the following year, the right-wing party defeated the socialists at the ballot box, winning an outright majority and almost double the amount of seats the socialists had won. The right-wing government began dismantling the socialist reforms of the past 2 years, only to be defeated by a narrow margin in the 1936 election and see the Socialist Popular Front, led by President Miguel Azaña, reinstitute the same measures. So at this point, generals of the right-wing leaning nationalist army began plotting to overthrow the Spanish government. And sensing this, the Spanish government began arming left-wing political organizations out of fear any right-wing revolt would have the support of the bulk of the army. So with tension between the two sides at its breaking point, General Emilio Mola declared open revolt against the socialist government in Navarre in July 1936. And though the attempted immediate overthrow of the government failed, the revolt was successful in the peripheries of Spain, the hinterlands. So the revolt got a huge boost when General Francisco Franco, commander of the Spanish Army of Africa, joined the revolt. And the breakout of the Spanish Civil War was seen internationally as an ideological battlefield. Communism and socialism on one side, and nationalism and increasingly fascism on the other. So as a result, those sympathetic to the socialist goals of the Popular Front flocked to Spain from throughout the Western world and formed the International Brigades. Now, Americans by law were actually disallowed. They would be violating the law if they joined militarily. So a lot of these Americans who went there formed ambulance brigades that they called the Lincoln Brigades. And so a lot of people like Ernest Hemingway is a great example of someone who participated in the Spanish Civil War as an American and served as an ambulance driver. So these were battalions and armies made up entirely of foreigners, including prominent men such as George Orwell, who originally went to Spain as a reporter. And though the nationalists were initially outnumbered and only controlled portions of Spain in the north and south, its leaders had soon reorganized their forces and added to their numbers through forced conscription in the territories they controlled. Conscription is involuntary draft. So by August, Nationalist planes were routinely bombing the capital, Madrid, with these operations intensified when Nazi Germany began aiding the nationalist forces in September 1936. The German Condor Legion, as it was called, provided an auxiliary air force for the Spanish nationalists and aided in the bombing of Madrid. Other foreign powers with autocratic nationalist governments also aided the Spanish nationalists, including Benito Mussolini in Italy and President Antonio Salazar of Portugal. Now, under the intense bombing campaign, the Republican government left Madrid in the fall of 1936. To make matters worse, the fascist, nationalist, and right-wing groups that had begun the uprising were coalescing behind a single leader, the leader of that Spanish army in Africa, Francisco Franco. Franco quickly consolidated his power by eliminating his enemies in the upper echelons of the nationalist movement and began fashioning a cult of personality similar to that of Mussolini in Italy, or Hitler in Germany. The Republican government led by the socialists, however, fell into deeper disarray. Azaña reshuffled his cabinet several times, trying to find the right men to lead the Republican war effort. Public opinion began to turn against the Republicans after a harsh crackdown on rioting workers in Barcelona. Remember, the Republican government was supposed to be the socialist heroes of the working man. So in early 1938, Franco's forces broke through the Republican lines and began encircling Madrid. And though the city would hold out until the end of the war, the encirclement and ensuing bombardment led to massive deaths in the city from starvation and shell fire. And with these breakthroughs, the Republicans' last remaining area of strength was in Catalonia in eastern Spain. In the Battle of Ebro in the summer and fall of 1938, Franco's forces smashed what remained of the Republican army, and Barcelona fell to the nationalists in January of 1939. In February of 1939, General Franco's nationalist government was recognized by the international community as the legitimate government of Spain, although the war did not officially end until Franco's troops marched into Madrid in March. What followed was a major crackdown on communists, socialists, and other political dissidents by the Franco government. And though estimates vary, approximately 100,000 Republican prisoners were either executed or died in concentration camps following Franco's victory. And historians estimate that nearly 500,000 Spaniards died in the conflict. Interesting note, Franco stayed the leader of Spain, and Spain, despite its close relationship with both Hitler and Mussolini, who had helped Franco succeed during the war, Spain stayed out of and remained neutral during World War II. And Franco stayed the ruler of Spain until the 1970s. So that's all I have for this week. If you guys don't have any questions.
I don't think so, no.
Okay. Then you guys have a good weekend, and I'll see you next Tuesday.